Good evening, everyone. Welcome on behalf of Spring Lake Township. Welcome to tonight's community forum. Happy to see this nice turnout in here. We also have people joining us live streaming on YouTube. The township is very excited to have this wetland mitigation expert, Michael Pennington, here to talk to us tonight about wetland mitigation banks. And before I introduce him, I'd like to just make a few comments. So tonight's forum is hosted by the Spring Lake Township Community Ambassador Committee. Do we have any members of the committee present? Okay. We saw a number of hands here. We'd like to thank them for their work in hosting tonight's forum and bringing this information to the community. If you're not familiar with the committee, it's an independent advisory body with its mission being to enhance community engagement, promote transparent communication, and foster relationships between the township and its residents, businesses, and visitors. Well, sure. My name is Crystal Morgan. I'm a municipal attorney. I've been providing services to the township for a long time, and I'm happy to be here tonight, kind of emceeing the meeting. Thank you for that. Tonight's meeting is being recorded and live streamed, as I indicated, so just a couple of housekeeping matters. We'd ask that you silence your cell phones. We do intend to have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so we'd ask you to reserve your questions until the end. And because we do have people watching this online, the way that this will work at the question and answer session is we'll just kind of go around the room. I'll have you stand and state your question. And then for the benefit of everyone in the room and those watching online, Lucas Hill from the township will be repeating those questions aloud and then offer an opportunity to Mr. Pennington to answer those. So tonight is not intended to be a public hearing on any particular application or project or property. The township has been approached by a developer regarding wetland mitigation banks. That information is available to you online regarding the application, regarding some proposed language. And there will be a meeting, a public hearing on that application coming up at the Planning Commission at its January 21st meeting. So if you're interested in that, there's information about that on the township's website that will be held here on the 21st at 7 p.m. So tonight, we're really here to talk about the nuts and bolts of wetland mitigation banks. What are they? How do they work? Mr. Pennington is going to talk about those things, the role that they play in wetland mitigation, and provide an example and some discussion on that. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Pennington. Mike Pennington is the Wetland Mitigation Specialist for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, EGLE, as it's familiarly known, the Water Resource Division of EGLE. Michael serves as the Program Administrator for EGLE's Wetland Mitigation Banking Program and provides assistance to staff on complex wetland mitigation issues. Michael also provides wetland education and training, and he plays a pivotal role for the division by providing technical and regulatory guidance for the best protection and management of the state's wetland resources. Before working for EGLE, Michael managed MDOT's wetland mitigation and wetland banking program for 14 years. He has been with the state for how many years? 28 years. So we are very thankful and appreciative that the committee was able to bring Mr. Pennington here, that he is here, and so I'm going to turn the microphone over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal, and hello, everybody. So I just got back from a week in Florida, so I'm still adjusting to these temperatures. And I just got back from the Michigan State game last night, so my voice is a little bit hoarse, so I'm gonna do the best I can. My goal today is basically just to give you a brief introduction of wetland banking, what wetland banking is, and how we got to the point where it's the preferred method of mitigation federally and in this state. One thing that's important to know is that Michigan is one of 2 states that have what's called federal assumption of the 404 Clean Water Act. So Michigan administers their own banking program. They administer inland lakes and streams regulations, wetlands regulations, and then we're actually audited by the EPA, but we're one of only 2 states that actually do that. So outside of the state, if you wanted to do a wetland bank, you go to the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers and Fish and Wildlife Service, and everyone meets to decide if the site's gonna get approved and stuff. So I'm gonna go through kind of how we got there, what a wetland bank is. The 14 years that I was at MDOT, I actually started the wetland banking program at MDOT, so I was on the regulated side of trying to get bank sites approved, and now I'm on the regulatory side of being the one that oversees bank sites. So I have to start with kind of the basics. So the reason that banking is a part is because by law, we require mitigation for unavoidable losses to wetland resources. And the goal basically is to restore as fully as possible the functions and public benefits of those lost resources. One thing that I do want to note is it's the replacement of unavoidably lost resources. So one thing that I'm going to hint at or emphasize is that as a department, you know, we still look at avoidance, minimization, and everything. Only if it's a permittable project do we consider mitigation for it. So Part 303, which is the wetland statute, basically these are the functions that are recognized in it. If you can go back one. All right, so these are the functions that are specifically recognized under Part 303. So if you read the actual statute, it says wetlands provide these functions and public benefits. Everyone knows, like flood and storm control. Wetlands provide wildlife habitat, protection of subsurface water resources, pollution treatment, erosion control. So the federal and state legislator has recognized that wetlands play an important role in the world as part of protecting the planet, as far as protecting the resources that we have. So when I talk about wetland mitigation, I'm actually talking about the sequencing that I mentioned earlier. And the sequencing that we have under statute is you have to avoid impacts to wetlands to the greatest extent possible. If you can't completely avoid them, you have to minimize the impacts by your actual project. So maybe there could be a different project configuration or something that minimizes those impacts. And after you've gone through those exercises, if it's a permittable project, you've done your best to avoid and minimize, but there's still some wetland impacts, that's where it gets into the compensatory mitigation. So when I talk about wetland banking, what I'm really referring to is that compensatory mitigation for permittable projects. So mitigation is required under statute for all projects that impact over 1/3 of an acre of wetland. So if you have any project, whether it's a residential development, commercial development that impacts over 1/3 of an acre wetland, by statute, you have to mitigate for that impact. The statute also says that projects under 1/3 of an acre, if a reasonable opportunity for mitigation exists. So before wetland bank sites, a lot of times we didn't require mitigation for projects under 1/3 of an acre because there wasn't a good opportunity to mitigate for those. Now, and I'll show you a map of this later, that there's bank sites, you know, especially from Clare North or Clare South, we often require mitigation for projects with smaller impacts, even over 1/10 of an acre, because we view wetland bank sites as a reasonable opportunity to mitigate for those impacts. So we have statutory mitigation ratios. So these are under the administrative rules under Part 303. We require 1.5 to 1 for emergent or shrub wetlands. So if you impact 1 acre of wetland that has cattails, you have to replace that with 1.5 acres. 2 to 1 for forested wetlands, lake fringe, and coastal wetlands. 5 to 1 for impacts to rare and imperiled wetlands. In general, in this state, we don't allow impacts to rare and imperiled wetlands. Those are super special wetlands like fens and bogs and southern floodplain forests and wet mesic flatwoods and all these other fancy words for for these extremely special wetlands that are rare in the state. And the statute actually has a list of all of those different wetland types. And then there's a 10-to-1 for preservation of exceptional quality wetlands. What that means is that if you're in an area like the UP of Michigan has very little wetland restoration opportunities because there's a lot of wetland, or it's rocky and it's really upland. So if you impact a wetland in the UP, we may allow you to preserve an already existing wetland that has exceptional quality. But that ratio is 10-to-1. So if you impact 1 acre of wetland, you have to protect at least 10 acres of exceptional quality wetland. And like I said, it's primarily for projects in northern lower Michigan, the UP, and some of them in other areas that have had extremely degraded wetlands. Like southeast Michigan has lost 96% of the wetlands that they used to have. If there's an opportunity to protect some of those remaining wetlands in southeast Michigan, we also allow that. So the way we got to wetland banking, we have to talk about the old mitigation preferences and the old way of doing business. So when I started with the state in '98, most of the mitigation happened on site. So if you had a big box store that had a parking lot expansion and they were going to impact 1 acre of wetland, they built an 1.5 acres or 2 acres of wetland right next to that parking lot area. So it was permit by permit. There was a ton of little small wetlands that were constructed all over the state for those specific projects. It didn't matter if the site was suitable to build a wetland at or not. They just said, you know, they already own the land, so we're going to build the wetland right next to where the impacted one is, and very little consideration for functions and values. So the picture that I'm showing here is it's in Pittsfield Township, Washtenaw County. It's in like an industrial area. I'm not sure which of these factories had an expansion, but let's assume they had a little expansion of this building here. They impacted a little bit of wetland. So what they did is they built a wetland on some property that they already had next to the factory, and they had to monitor it for 5 years, and then after those 5 years, their obligation was done as long as that met performance standards during that 5 years. And that's going to be important when we discuss banking. So the results of that, this is what it looks like for those of you that know some plants. Does anyone know what this big, tall, wispy plant is? Phragmites. So Phragmites is the great big tall plant that outcompetes everything. The other plant you see here is super common. It's cattail. And cattail, there's 3 different species. This is non-native cattail. Again, this is the type of cattail that basically comes in and outcompetes a lot of the native wetland plants and stuff. So a lot of these smaller wetlands, you know, they had poor success. They were small, so they didn't have a lot of functioning, a lot of invasive species. And as long as you met those criteria for 5 years, your obligation was done. You walk away, no one ever has to look at that wetland again. So that was the old way that we used to do things. There was still an easement on it, so it was still protected from not being built on, but there was no more management for it, and whatever happened after that 5 years just naturally happened. So the result of that, what was happening in Michigan was also happening in the US. So in 2008, there came this federal mitigation rule from the EPA that basically changed mitigation preferences. So they looked at the success of mitigation nationwide, and they said, you know, some of the sites aren't even constructed. The ones that are constructed are not functioning well. They're either upland or they're open water. Very few of the sites were very successful. So what they did is they changed the preference to what's called third-party mitigation. And what that means is it's two different things. It was a preference towards wetland banks and a preference towards in lieu of fee, which I'm not really gonna go into because we don't have that program in Michigan, but we did hang on to the wetland bank part. The other thing they did is they put more of an emphasis on a watershed approach. So instead of just building your wetland right next to the impacted wetland, let's try to plan these sites in a more comprehensive plan where you have better control of what functions and values they provide in areas that have seen historical losses. Let's put the wetlands back where they used to be that carried out those functions. So what we did at EGLE is, in 2009 is we made amendments to Part 303 to basically mirror what the federal mitigation rule did. So we changed the preference. The preference used to be to on-site, immediate vicinity, and off-site. We changed that to the number one preference is purchase of credits from a wetland mitigation bank. The restoration of previously existing wetland. What's meant by that is going into areas that were historically wetland that have been drained and farmed and manipulated for the last 50 to 80 years and trying to restore those areas back into wetland, as opposed to taking a 50-foot tall sand hill and excavating it down to the water table. So the third is creation of new wetlands, which is that older concept, but we don't really see much of that going on because there are other restoration opportunities in their bank sites. And then lastly, the preservation of exceptional wetlands. The reason that preservation is last is because it still leads to a net loss of wetland resources. So if you impact 1 acre of wetland and you protect 10 acres, because remember it's a 10-to-1 ratio, you still lost 1 acre of wetland, right? That 10 acres that you protect was already there. So that's why we have a preference towards wetland banking, restoration of wetlands. The other thing that we did is we put language in there about watershed approach. So let's look at the quality and quantity of aquatic resources, consider the landscape position and changing landscape. Like, you know, if you can restore a wetland adjacent to a stream, you know you're gonna have protection of those nutrients going into the stream. You're gonna have protection from flooding and everything. So let's try to do a better job of putting wetlands where they should be. And then consider current and future habitat trends. So those are the two things that are in our statute now. The preference changed and the watershed approach to try to more mimic what the federal mitigation rule said. So that's why we started doing wetland banking. So we wanted to try to develop a program that had larger, better functioning sites across the state instead of these little tiny wetlands that really weren't doing much. So administrative rules for wetland banking came into place in 1997. I think our first bank site was 2001, but it really started to take off in the last like 10 to 15 years, and I'll show you a trend. So when I was at MDOT, and they said you can no longer just build wetlands in advance without going through the bank site. Of course, MDOT doesn't like change, and we don't like people telling us what to do. So we fought it just like everyone else did. You know, why should we have to bank? We've been doing it this way for 20 years, so forth and so on. But pretty much EGLE, which was DEQ at the time, said we're not going to approve any credits unless you do a bank. So we started the banking program at MDOT. And now MDOT has like 15 or so bank sites on the ground. So we fought it initially, but I think in the end it's actually a good thing. But what is a wetland bank? So wetland bank, it's basically, like I said, it's that third-party mitigation. So an entity called a bank sponsor that's not related to individual projects that wants to establish wetland areas in advance of anticipated losses. So the bank sponsor comes to us, they say, hey, we have this site, we think it would make a good bank site. We have separate administrative rules that dictate what we require. We have to go out to the site and see it. We have to make sure it's suitable, make sure it's not existing wetland. So there's a bunch of things that we have to do with the process, but basically the key thing is it's new wetlands on the ground, functioning, doing well before credits are ever taken out of that site. So a wetland bank site provides credits on a per acre basis. So if you restore 100 acres of new wetland that's meeting performance standards, you have 100 acres of credit. The credits service specific watersheds and ecoregions, and I'll show you a couple maps of what that means by statute, but we have everything on a GIS system also, so you can actually better see what that means. And like I said, it's a preferred method of mitigation in this state and federally. So the benefits to the state. The reason EGLE and the reason the state likes wetland banks is it's an increase in state wetland resources before impacts occur. So the way it used to be is you get a permit, you build your wetland, build your project, but that wetland could fail. You could have to do corrective action. You could have to replant, reseed. There's a lot of things that could go wrong, but the applicant already has the permit and has already constructed the actual project. So for us, there's probably between 1,000 and 2,000 acres of wetland on the ground right now in banks well before credits are ever going to be used at these sites, because there's performance standards that the bank sponsors have to meet and they have to be successful in everything. Most of the banks are larger and better functioning wetlands. They're located in areas where they should be that were formerly wetland. I would say the average bank size is probably like around 50 acres. There's banks that are 350 acres, a lot of banks that are 100 acres in size. So there are these large restored wetlands in areas where wetlands used to be. It facilitates watershed planning. So like the bank sponsors have to tell us, like, how does this bank site fit within the watershed plan for that area? And one of the things that I really like about it is banks require long-term management. And I'll explain what that is in a bit, but you don't monitor it for 5 years and then you're done. So with the applicant benefits, it reduces their permit processing times because they don't have to go out and hire a consultant and find a site and design a site and submit that information with us before they submit the application. It ensures the success and availability of mitigation, but it doesn't ensure a permittable project. So the way that EGLE's structured is I work in Lansing. I'm the statewide specialist. I work on all the bank sites. I assist all of the district staff with large, kind of complex projects that impact mitigations like mines and gravel pits and data centers and Amazon warehouses. So I don't really get involved in the permittability of the project. That's the district staff's job. My job is to, if that's a permittable project, then I give them the best solution to mitigate for that actual project. So I oversee the banking program, and then they come to me and say, hey, I got this application. It says you're going to use this bank. Is there credits? Is there not credits? Is the best site to use? So it's like a layer of protection between the mitigation and the actual project, which I like, and I think it's an important thing. When banking first started, people thought if you build a bank site, that ensures you're going to get a permit for your project, but it does not. You still have to go through avoidance, minimization, and everything. So some of the minimum requirements under statute, it's a minimum 10 acres in size for like a new bank. So if you build a 9-acre bank site, we can't release any credits because it's not 10 acres in size. But like I said, most of them are about 50 acres. There's a signed banking agreement between EGLE and the bank sponsor prior to construction of the bank. And that's really important. I know there's a banking template on the website, you said?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So if you like Google EGLE wetland banking, you'll see the templates, you'll see the process, you'll see the administrative rules, everything. But the signed banking agreement is basically a contract between the state and the bank sponsor that outlines everything to do at that site. Here's the location of the site, here's the functions and values, here's the size we're intending to construct. We're gonna construct it this way. We're gonna seed it with these seeds. We're gonna plant it with these plants. We're gonna have these water control structures. And then we're gonna monitor that, and the site has to meet performance standards before we release credits. So if you build a wetland and it's not doing very good, we don't release credits, and the bank sponsor can't sell any of those credits to people that impact wetlands. So we have pretty strict performance standards on, it has to be less than 10% invasive species, it has to have a certain number of native wetland species, certain percent cover. So there's all these standards that the bank sponsors have to meet before we ever release credits at those sites. Most bank sites are probably on the 7 to 10 year time frame before all of the credits are actually released, because you know we held them to the standard of invasive species and everything. And then the other thing is, before they get their last release of credit, so say the bank's been doing great, it's functioning really good, the bank sponsor comes to me and say, I want my last release of credits. We don't release it until they have a long-term management plan, find a conservancy to manage the site, and set up what's called a non-wasting endowment with a community foundation that's gonna fund perpetual management of the site. So we have a financial assurance, like a bond on the bank when the bank site is first constructed. We don't release that bond until the bank sponsor does all those things and then signs another agreement with us and the conservancy that shows how the site's gonna be managed long-term and funded and all that stuff. But they have to fund long-term management. So if you look at watersheds and ecoregions, this is a terrible diagram, but this is the diagram referenced under statute. So this is your mitigation watershed layer. It's like 63 watersheds, so all of these squiggly lines are a watershed. We have it in a GIS system, but this is the map that's referenced. So a bank site services a watershed, and it services an ecoregion, which is just a different geographic area based on glacial impact and wildlife and plant species and everything. So if you see the Saginaw Lake Plain area, it's basically following how the glaciers came in and receded. So this area here right next to the lake is a different area than the Ann Arbor moraine, which is hillier and everything. So a bank site will service both the watershed and the ecoregion, which basically looks like this. So this is Shiawassee County here, so Lansing is, so Shiawassee County, if this red star, which you probably can't even see it's a star, but if this red star represents where the bank site is, the watershed is in green and the ecoregion is in gray. So if there's an impact in this area, we want it to go to the watershed first, but if there's no bank in the watershed, we allow it to go to this gray area. That gray area, it's called Lansing ecoregion. It's a huge one. Most of them are not that big. Most of the service area for bank sites are a lot smaller. So the use of bank credits, like I said, they need to be in the same watershed or ecoregion. We still may sometimes, as a department, require mitigation to be on site. Like I said, southeast Michigan, where there's been 96 to 98% wetland loss. If you impact a wetland there, we're gonna want you to do at least 1-to-1 restoration of wetland so that there's no longer a loss in that actual area. Bank credit should be based on functions and values. And like I said, there's a preference of watershed over ecoregion. So this is an example. I live in Charlotte, Michigan. There's a bank site there. So the upper diagram is what it looked like before it was constructed. These little darker areas were basically existing wetlands. So if you look at aerial photos, dark areas are wetter areas. After they constructed it, it was much darker. They constructed this part of it, but they didn't construct this until this year, so that's why it's lighter. It's basically like a checkbook registry. Like if this site has 60 acres, if a project uses one, and now it only has 59 acres. If another project uses an acre, and now it only has 58 acres. So it basically uses its acres until it's done, and then it has a transition over to that long-term management phase. So if you look at the banking trends, I think I started with the department in 2010. My life was awesome. There was like 15 bank sites. You know, I could go check them out. It was great. And now there's like 68 sites. Most of them are entering the long-term management phase, and I deal with all this other stuff that I never used to deal with, but that's fine. So the main thing though is that there's been a huge trend in bank sites because it took a while for even like applicants and consultants to transition to the point where we said you have to use a bank site. You can't do on-site. We got a lot of applications that were trying to mitigate on-site, and we said no. So if you look at the service area for banks, so these little dots that you really can't see are where the bank sites are located. So there's 3 of them in the UP. There's a couple of them in Northern Lower. Northern Lower doesn't issue a lot of permits because it's hilly and it's easy to avoid and minimize impacts to wetlands. So like if you have a project and you want to put it in a wetland, why not put it right over there where there's not a wetland? So most of the action is downstate, but this is where most of the bank sites are. But everything in green has a bank site that currently services that area. So we have a couple tools to find suitable sites. I don't know if you guys have ever seen EGLE's Wetlands Map Viewer. It's our online GIS system where you can look at aerial photos and you can look at soils and you can look at a whole bunch of different things. It has what's called a high potential restoration layer, which looks at areas that were formerly wetland that aren't currently marked as wetland. And we use other online tools like Web Soil Survey. So Spring Lake Township, I assume that's the shape of Spring Lake Township, correct? Because I got that
Yep.
off the map viewer. So when I'm looking for suitable restoration areas, I'm looking for what I call red blobs. So this red and orange and yellow, those are when you turn on that high potential restoration layer, the whole state is filled with these red, orange, and yellow areas, and that's what we're looking for a suitable wetland bank site. So the red blobs are the best because red blobs are currently not mapped as wetland, although they could still be wetlands. You have to field check it. Currently not mapped as wetland, have hydric soils, which means were formerly wetland soils. And pre-European settlement were marked as like swampy areas. So red blobs are best, yellow blobs are next. Those are just like wetland soil areas. And then the orange is just pre-European settlement, said it was like a swampy area. So in your guys' township, on paper, you have the swath here that looks like it's suitable, but if you turn on the aerial photo, it's not. It's either like a lot of it's existing wetland or it's already developed, or there's not a lot, like, because generally it's farmland. So there's not a lot of farmland. Like, I'm not super familiar with this area, but when I turned on the recent aerial photo, this isn't just a lot of farmland. You know, there's a lot of farmland in this area and in this area here, but a lot of this is already developed. So even though it shows up as suitable, you can't exactly rely on the maps. You're looking for big blob areas throughout the state that still have some of those existing farms left. So I want to give you a really quick example. Am I doing pretty good for time or? Okay. So this is an older site. I like it because it's not one of our bank sponsor sites, so I'm not like selectively choosing one of our bank sponsors that builds like a lot of wetlands. This is a municipal project. It's called Bear Swamp Drain Bank. It's located in Allegan County, and it was established by the Allegan County Drain Commissioner. So it's by the village of Hopkins. I don't know if you guys are familiar with where that is, but I'm going to go through like why it was established. So if you look at a 1998 aerial photo, this is what it looked like. When I look at this, basically, like I said, you're looking for darker soil sites. So you see all these little dark areas. So there's probably some existing wetlands. Even though this area is farmed, there's likely some existing wetlands in these dark areas. And if you look at the soils, it's basically muck soil sites, which is one of the more popular types of soils that you can build wetlands in. If you look at high potential restoration layer, it's in a red blob area. So it's in a red blob, except for it's missing this little chunk here. The reason it's missing this little chunk here is at the time that the wetland inventory was done, it had marked this area as actually wetland. So if you turn on the wetland inventory and the high potential restoration area, you'll see that this whole area is suitable to restore back into wetland, because at the time that we inspected it, not a lot of this area was actually wetland. So that's a big part of my job, is going out to sites, inspecting the sites, making sure they're not already existing wetland, making sure it's suitable soils, making sure you can restore it back into wetland. That's like the first step before we ever say, yes, you can proceed with giving us a banking agreement. So the service area for the Bear Swamp Drain, here's the site right there with the red star. It's in the Kalamazoo River watershed. It's in this ecoregion, which I can't read from here. I don't have all of the ecoregions memorized, but it's 6.3.3. You're 3.1, 6.3.1. But anyway, like I said, it's like glaciation based and everything, so most of them trend this way. So that site services everything in the green and in the gray. The goals, yeah, okay, all right. The goals for Bear Swamp were to alleviate flooding in the village of Hopkins. They had a huge flooding issue. Every rainfall event would flood the village and everything, so they wanted to try to control water, upgrading it from there to try to alleviate the flooding. Water quality, wildlife habitat, and funding for future flood detention projects. Just some of the specifics. It was a 55-acre site. The easement on it was like 80 acres, but they only intended to restore like 55 acres. So that's kind of your average size. Muck soils, tile drained with a history of farming. They signed a banking agreement with our department in 2007, proceeded to construct it, and then they monitored it for about 4 or 5 years. Just a conceptual design, we don't really need to get into it, but there was a bunch of tiles which are below the ground that drain the water for like farmers. So a bunch of tiles that went to this main drain. So when you construct it, you break the tiles, you put in a water control structure, which in this case, it was a sheet pile weir. And then that way you can control the water on your site, and then they planted it and seeded it and did all that stuff. So pre-construction, it looks like any muck field. So there it is. During construction, you know, all of these bank sites, they require grading. It's just like if you're grading a parking lot or something for like a new building. They have low head berms around them, which are like small little hills. You grade them at certain elevations to get the wetland types you want. It's a major undertaking. Most 50+ acre sites take 2 to 4 months to build. You got equipment running nonstop, so it's like a major construction project. And then afterward, you seed it, you plant it. You have to plant 400 trees per acre. So A 50-acre site would require like 20,000 trees. So I mean, there's a lot involved in it. You have to place wildlife habitat structures, which are what these little logs are here. We don't really like just logs bought from like a log place. We like natural logs. So most people put in like natural stumps and trees that they might get from like the county road commission or something. And then this is a terrible picture of a planted tree. They also put in, so we also require the habitat structures, so there are some other like logs and stuff here. With this one, they did these sand mounds for like turtle nesting, which is cool. With sand mounds, you do have to maintain them. So like most people don't use sand mounds because it's kind of a constant maintenance. You got to go in there and remove the vegetation and the trees and everything that grows. But we try it every once in a while. It's kind of cool to see it pre and post. So this was the pre aerial photo and the post. So the sand mounds really stick out because they are above the water table, so they show up as bright. Post construction, this is what it looked like the first year or two post construction. This is what a wetland bank site should look like the first couple of years. The first year looks kind of ugly. It's like it just had surgery. It was just seeded and planted. There's a lot of like weedy species that show up. But if you designed it correctly, if you're monitoring, if you're controlling the water correctly, what you're looking to get is this wet, meadowy type of community. So really good plant diversity, not a lot of invasive species. And then you're planting trees and shrubs in this wet meadow community to develop the type of wetland that you want. You can incorporate open water, you can incorporate other stuff, but water control and management of these sites is super important. So you have to grade them kind of flat so you can uniformly control the water on that site. 3 to 4 inches of too much water or too little water makes a huge difference, which most people would not think that. Final results, they went through 5 years of monitoring. They got their full credit release. It ended up being a little bit smaller than they predicted. So our department only gives you credit for what you build that successful wetland. So if you intend to build 55 acres of wetland, but only 45 are restored, we only give you credit for 45 acres of wetland. If you intend to build all forested wetland and all your trees die and you have emergent wetland, we only give you credit for emergent wetland. So just because it's in the banking agreement, what you intend to do, we only give you credit for what you do by wetland type. And then the site is currently undergoing long-term management and maintenance. I think of that like 45 acres, only 5 or so acres have been sold. So this site's been on the ground since 2007. So it's had like 18 years of functioning, providing flood storage for the village, and there hasn't even been as many impacts to use up all of that site. So that's the benefit part of wetland banking to the department, because these sites are on the ground functioning and not necessarily being used that fast. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
I had a question here on the.
Well, I guess I was asking like this.
Okay.
Wetland bank site, okay? I'm gonna develop a shopping center over here, and I'm gonna wipe out these wetlands and buy 20 acres of this wetland so I can then do 20 acres of.
Do you want to repeat it into the?
So I think, and help me, I'm going to try and repeat the question.
For like the
so
YouTube
we can,
folks.
so people on YouTube could hear it. No, I'm going to try and repeat that. But basically, is it a method to replace wetlands in one spot, you know, or to impact wetlands in one spot and replace them in another? So I think that's like the short version. So I guess we'll leave it at
Yeah, so I think my answer to that is kind of getting back to what I said earlier about the permittability of the project. You know, just because there's a bank site there doesn't mean that we automatically permit projects to use it. That project still has to go through avoidance, minimization, all of that stuff. If they do that and it gets to the point where it's a permittable project by the department under the criteria under Part 303, which is a statute, then we generally do allow it then to go to a wetland bank site.
That would be that.
Yes.
So they,
No, they would, whatever we permitted, so let's say it was a 50-acre site and there were 20 acres of wetland on it, and we permitted them to impact 5 acres, which is a large impact. In this area, like, a lot of the impacts are smaller just because you can avoid it, and like, you know, subdivisions are different than like a big box, like Amazon warehouse that needs like a certain size and stuff. If of that 20 acres, there was a permitted impact of 5 acres, let's say it was 5 acres of forested wetland, that applicant that is developing that development would have to buy 10 acres of credit from a wetland bank site. But then the other 15 acres remain there, and we probably require an easement over the other 15 acres so they don't develop it more. Want to repeat it?
So if you impact 1 acre, you have to buy 2? That's the question?
If it's forested wetlands, so the impact goes by wetland type. So the slide I showed earlier with the statutory ratios, if you impact 1 acre of cattail, you got to buy 1.5 acres of emergent wetland. If you impact 2 acres or 1 acre of forested wetland, the automatic ratio is 2 to 1. So you have to buy 2 acres of wetland. The reason we do that is at like temporal loss, right? Like you impact 2 acres of forested wetland, you're replacing it with 2 acres of a wetland that's not fully developed yet. The trees might only be 10 feet tall and everything, so we require more acres for that like temporal loss, basically. Let's go to the back, because you had your hand up.
The question is, what kind of entities are bank sponsors?
So bank sponsors vary. MDOT's a bank sponsor because MDOT has a banking program for their own use. The County Road Commission is a bank sponsor, so they have some banks that they've constructed for their own use. Drain commissioners are bank sponsors, and then private entities are bank sponsors. Most of the private entities that are bank sponsors are like environmental companies that have the expertise. So the majority of the banks that are constructed and that are bank sponsors are either environmental folks like myself or people that partner with developers to construct bank sites. Sometimes there are other people dabbling in it. The dabbling in it part usually doesn't work very good for them for the first few years because they don't understand the management part. So they might build it, but they don't get credits released for several years until they hire somebody to manage it appropriately or they figure out how to actually do it. Sure.
So was that a question or a statement? I wasn't
So
sure.
it's like,
But
does the bank sponsor have to be qualified to do the work? Is that kind of the?
yeah, okay. I think you've
But you gotta
got it better
repeat
than I did.
Oh, okay, so if I
Yeah,
repeat
yeah.
into the mic, it's fine too then. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, got it. Like, I don't know why I was doing that. Okay. Yes, so we require, when you submit a banking pre-proposal, which you submit to our department, that triggers me to go out and look at the site and meet with you. You have to submit qualifications of the bank sponsor also. So you can't alone, like, someone that's never built a bank before, like, someone that does like sand and gravel, that's never built a bank, they can't come to me and say, I'm building this bank. Because you have to demonstrate that you're working with somebody that you can successfully restore the site. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have experience, because there have been successful bank sites established by people without experience, but they're always working with consultants, and they're working with people that know what they're doing. They're hiring out the monitoring and the maintenance and all that stuff. But, yeah. Well, the white ones are just
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you want to do that?
Yeah.
Okay,
So
go
the
ahead.
question was, when you're looking for these potential wetlands to restore, you're looking for, if you turn on the high potential restoration layer on wetlands map viewer, you're looking for red blobs, yellow blobs, or these orangish areas. The rest of the state is white, basically. So in general, yes, you're looking for the red blobs, then the yellow blobs, then the orange. Most of the white areas are not suitable at all. So they're upland areas, they're areas that could be existing wetland, they're just areas that are not suitable for restoration in general. But, every map is a map that was created at some point in time that doesn't accurately reflect how things are. So if somebody submits a banking pre-proposal to me to look at, and it's not in one of those, even if it is in a red blob area or yellow area, I still inspect it to see if it's possible to restore a wetland there. Some areas that are suitable are not shown in red or yellow, and then the bank sponsor has to do certain things to document that it's suitable. Other areas that are shown in red, I go out there and I'm like, this is already existing wetland, you can't get credit for it. So that field review is really the first step. They submit information to me that says, hey, we think this is a good site, here's the conceptual design, here's the soils, here's how we're gonna build it. But then when I go out there and look at it and dig soils and look at the water, and I always bring like a GPS to take elevations of features out there, that's really when we make the final determination if it's suitable or not. Yeah. Sure. So the question is, what happens with these sites long-term when they're turned over to conservancies? Does EGLE inspect the sites or monitor the sites? So the answer to that is yes. So the way that the process works, and it's a little complicated, but the bank sponsor gives money to a community foundation, which is an entity that holds and invests money for 501c3s. So like the Detroit Art Institute has funding from community foundations. There's a community foundation that services every county in Michigan. They're like an investment company, but they're only investing for 501c3s. When that bank sponsor wants their last release of credit, they sign a different agreement than the banking agreement, which is called a stewardship agreement. That's between us, the conservancy, and the bank sponsor, us meaning EGLE. That outlines what's going to happen at the site. We require annual inspections of the site, annual invasive species control. They have to visit it 2 or 3 times a year, take photos, control invasive species, write a report to EGLE that we review and the community foundation in order to continue to get funding from the community foundation to keep doing the management. If that conservancy dissolves, the money is still at the community foundation. So then EGLE basically works to find a new long-term manager to fulfill that task. So the reason that we set it up that way is exactly for that. Like, we didn't want to give the money directly to a brand new conservancy that just started for them to invest themselves, because if they did something wrong or spent the money, that money's gone. The community foundations have been around for a long time. That's their purpose. You know, they have to invest money a certain way and everything. So that's the system that we kind of set up to ensure that those lands would be inspected annually and reports are written and everyone looks at it. At EGLE, we have a ton of easements, like, because we have a ton of those like small easements also. So we kind of, I mean, there's way more easements than we have staff for. Banks are a little different because, like, I'm a dedicated banking person, so I go out to these sites numerous times each year anyway to make sure, you know, because bank sponsors want credit releases and to make sure they're being maintained and everything. We do have like a rotating schedule of easements through the districts where a district might have like, whatever, 500 or 1,000 easements, but they're supposed to get to on like a 5-year cycle those easements, but they're looking for encroachment, they're looking for this and that. Since there's stewardship agreements and funding and reporting required for the bank sites, then we make sure we're out there every year for them. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is what happens if the money runs out? If the money runs out, something really bad happened. Like, period, because the money might drop in half and there may not be as many funds as you need to do what you need to do, but, you know, it's relatively new for the long-term management stuff. So I don't think the money's gonna run out. Catastrophic events, I mean, in my 28-year career at the wetland sites I've been involved in, we haven't really had one that wasn't fixable, I guess. Like a berm, so a berm is a small hill on the outside of these sites that allows you to control the actual water. Sometimes muskrats will burrow through them. Sometimes the control structures will get undermined. It's all stuff that that you got to do corrective action on. I mean, you can't just leave a site and then never inspect it. But to date, most of this stuff has been fixable. Like, I can't think of a site that's had like a catastrophic event. I mean, even if it burns, you're gonna get natural succession coming in. You may have enough funds to replant and stuff, so. Okay, so the question is, how does constructing a wetland bank go along with the 2020 master plan? So, I mean, I don't really know much about the plan, but in my personal view, wetland banking is kind of like an agricultural activity. I mean, you're seeding it, you're planting trees in it. It's no different than like tree farms and stuff like that, except for it's then allowed to be natural. You are removing farmland, So you are removing like a traditional farmland. But to me, it's still like an agriculture, it's still like an open space agricultural use. So we don't allow banks to be constructed in land that's under PA 115, or PA 116, which is Open Land and Farmland Preservation Act. But, you know, we do consider it kind of like an agricultural use. But that's my like personal opinion, so.
And that, and present that in your public comment if you're so inclined, because that will be part of the planning commission's discussion presumably when they're looking at the application to determine whether to amend the zoning ordinance to allow wetland mitigation banks, because that is what the application is for. So I would encourage that comment or that question to be directed at planning commission or township staff, and allow Mr. Pennington to talk about his experience. So, so
Bank sponsor to do that?
application is available on the website,
Okay.
and what the I'm just briefly summarizing, but what the application seeks to do is it's asking the township to consider an amendment to the zoning ordinance that would allow for wetland mitigation banking in the township, because currently the zoning ordinance doesn't recognize that as a lawful use of land. And so essentially that application is before the planning commission to consider whether the zoning ordinance should be amended in that fashion. Then that would be a recommendation to the township board. So there's a process for that. That's the application that is before the planning commission. It will be a public hearing, so there will be an opportunity to present comment at that meeting on the 21st at 7 p.m. at this location.
Hey, go ahead. Yeah, so the question is about enforceability of the bank sites after the bank sponsor has moved on and potentially the property's been sold. So all of these banks require a conservation easement that's conveyed to EGLE. So EGLE is the enforcing unit of that conservation easement area. So like there's an easement conveyed to us that says you can't develop it, you can't cut down trees except for safety, you can't basically do anything except for passive recreation out there. And you have to abide by the stewardship agreement, so you still have to control invasive species and everything. So, I mean, that enforcement really falls upon us. And I mean, we deal with a lot of complaints, like my neighbors mowing this area that has an easement and everything. And we do have compliance and enforcement staff in each of the districts that go out to inspect those things. But the property owners that, are taking over these properties have to abide by the easement. They have to abide by the easement that's recorded with the Register of Deeds. When they buy the property, they're gonna see there's an easement on it, there's a banking agreement, there's a stewardship agreement. Yeah. Yep. So, yeah. So generally, I think the way that plays out is, the property owner realizes there's an easement on it. They realize something to do with that easement is impacting their property. They contact us, we contact whoever is in charge of the property at the time, and we try to get resolution to it. It's happened from time to time, and we have, so like, long-term management, of course, a lot of these sites are transitioning to it. But yes, we've had bank sites where, like, the berm, inlet pipe gets plugged and it's causing some flooding, and we contact the bank sponsor and say, hey, we got a call about flooding, you have to go fix the problem. Well, I don't know why, like, so the question is, if the township does nothing or approves it, why would the township want to do it? Yeah, I mean, sort of. Do you want to rephrase it, or?
It sounds to me like the question is, if the township decides not to allow wetland mitigation banks as a lawful use of land
Yeah.
in the township, what would be the alternatives for wetland mitigation within the township?
Okay, yeah, so if the township, and I mean, I'm completely unbiased, like, my job is to just review sites, make sure they're gonna be good bank sites. If the township does not have its own bank site, and like, we deal with this with other townships that have wetland ordinances, like Meridian Township. If there's a permittable project within the township in a watershed, and the township doesn't have a bank site, that impact goes to whatever bank site is available. So right now in the Grand, there's a bank site in Charlotte that's available. There was a bank site in Kent County. There's banks being proposed all the time, so there's gonna be more bank sites in the Grand, but right now the bank sites in the Grand with credits are in Charlotte, and they're in a town called like Mulliken, which is quite a ways away. So it's still within the watershed, it's still providing those functions, but from my standpoint, it's better to have banks closer to where the impacts occur, but that's just not the way that the statute works, really. Other questions, Jim? Did you have one, or? All right. Hmm? Yeah, it's not a wetland banking question, and I'm the wetland banking person. So I'm gonna, like,
You're from the state, and you're here to help us.
on the role of wetland banking.
So maybe we can take some information that you conveyed and turn that into a question. If there are concerns about the water table, does the water table affect the potential restoration areas? Is that part of the equation?
Yeah, so it depends. It affects it in a positive way, either way, but it depends. There's two types of bank sites. Like, I'm a lumper, not a splitter, so to me, there's two types of bank site. Well, two types of wetland restoration sites, period. Sites that are surface water driven, that have clays underneath them, or some type of like aquitard or something, and sites that are connected to the water table, where like it could be sands, it could be mucks, it could be something like that. So, getting back to the functions and values of the bank sites that are connected to the water table, that you're actually storing that water and cleaning that. So like it rains or snow melts and you're connected to the water table, you're mixing with plants, the plants are like cleaning the water. You're helping with that recharge and discharge, as opposed to prior to building the bank, that water went into drain tiles and immediately went into the closest drain and then went downstream and increased flooding and everything. So that's my like personal philosophy on it, just based on how wetland construction goes. Yeah, exactly. Right, yep. And then there's confined aquifers and unconfined aquifers, but we're not gonna get into that, so go ahead.
Like most of the
Sure. So the question is, how does the money side of wetland banking work, and about public banks being developed? So I unfortunately mentioned public entities first. The biggest bank sponsors in the state, I mean, MDOT's a big one. The biggest bank sponsors of the state are private, so they're mostly consultants that are developing. The reason that the reason that MDOT and the reason that the county road commissions and all those people started doing banking is because they didn't want to delay their projects, one, and it was slightly cheaper, probably two. So they're doing banks specifically, like a bank sponsor is going to go where the credit need is. So they're going into the developing areas, they're going to, Southeast Michigan and Grand Rapids area. They're not going into where MDOT's doing a road project up in northern Michigan or something. The public entities that are building banks can only use them for themselves. They can't sell. So MDOT only uses bank sites for themselves. County Road Commission only uses bank sites for themselves, so forth and so on. As far as the private side, it costs a lot of money to establish a bank site. Like, it's got to be constructed, it's got to be, you have to design it, you have to have survey, you have to have title work, because you have to have clean title, you got to do all the banking agreement, it's got to be constructed. Probably the average price of constructing a bank site right now is around like $50,000 per acre. So it's expensive. So like a 40-acre site is going to cost a bank sponsor at least $1 million. Yeah. So it's a business. Yeah. So they develop bank sites. They sell them for $100,000 or so an acre. But a lot of that goes to taxes, of course, because everyone pays taxes and everything. So yes, for them it's a business. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, does EGLE have ordinances that townships use, or like example ordinances? It's all over the board. Some townships don't have any authority and want nothing to do with it. Some townships have passed moratoriums restricting wetland development. It's just all over the board. I would say probably 70% of the townships don't want anything to do with it. They don't have an ordinance to develop a bank. They don't have one to not develop a bank site. Bank sponsors are required to contact all adjacent property owners, all municipalities. We do our own public noticing to register of deeds, and we coordinate with EPA and Army Corps of Engineers and Fish and Wildlife Service. So there's multiple layers of public notice that go out to the surrounding area when a bank site is going to be established.
The request before the township right now is to amend the zoning ordinance to expressly allow for these mitigation banks within the township. So the planning commission will review the application, make a recommendation to the township board. Ultimately, it's up to the township board to determine whether to amend the zoning ordinance in that fashion. And it's not uncommon, I guess to your earlier question, it's not uncommon for a township to look at what other communities are doing in terms of their ordinances or their process. That's not unusual, whether it be with wetland mitigation or other issues. So that would be all part of the review process typically. I think there was also a question about how long these last, and you mentioned conservation easements. Is the idea that these banks sites exist in perpetuity?
Yeah, so the conservation easements last in perpetuity. What that means is if something drastically changes in the state, I mean, I don't know, because you can't predict everything, but yeah, the easements have no expiration date. They're on there in perpetuity. We've required conservation easements as a department since like the 2000s. Very hard to ever amend an easement. An easement for a bank site will never be amended. Like, we're never going to then allow somebody to build on it, but sometimes with private easements, we might if there was an easement over upland or something like that. But yes, the intent is perpetuity management in perpetuity. That's why we structured it to have the community foundations hold the funds. And then, you know, conservancies might come and go, but there's big conservancies that would probably be around for a long time, so. Yeah, so the easement right, so the question is, if you have like one big property with an easement on it, what happens, like if you subdivide it or something?
Well, yeah, what you, well, we got this deed, but the deed
Right.
only built on the part that's not.
Yeah, so if you buy 100 acres and 50 acres of it is an easement that was a bank site, you can't touch that 50 acres that was a bank site. You can only develop the non easement part of it. Yeah.
There could be considerations for local enforcement. It would be similar to other things that the township might regulate, like docks or something to that effect, where the state is involved in that process. So enforcement would be determined probably on a case-by-case basis. But an ordinance has enforcement mechanisms. The township has the ability to enforce the zoning.
Okay, any other questions?
Well, I would like to.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us, and for suggesting some other resources online, the wetland map viewer, the rules, statutes, everything available on the EGLE website. That's all very helpful as well. And then again, if we could just have a quick round of applause for the committee members and for putting this together and making all of this possible tonight. Thank you, very good. Thank you to those of us, those of you